Hello, sword people. Welcome to the Sword Guy podcast. This is your host, Dr. Guy Windsor, consulting swordsman, teacher, and writer. Join me for interviews with historical martial arts instructors and experts from a wide range of related disciplines as we discuss swords, history, training, and bringing the joy of historical martial arts into our modern lives. I hope you enjoy this greatest hit episode of the show. You can find all the episodes at swordschool.com/podcast, and there's a direct link in the description to this episode's show notes. On with the show.
I'm here today with the author and living historian Ruth Goodman. She's written several excellent books that we'll be talking about today, including The Domestic Revolution, How to Be a Tudor, and How to Behave Badly in Elizabethan England. She is basically the doyenne of British living history. So, without further ado, Ruth, welcome to the show.
Hello.
So, Ruth, whereabouts are you?
Wales. It's marvellous.
Wales. Okay. I can hear my Welsh listeners cheering in the background.
Yay!
Excellent. Any particular bit of Wales?
I'm not telling you that. You might come here. It's lovely without any visitors. It's gorgeous.
All right, you heard that here, people. Stay the hell out of Wales. It's Ruth's. Marvelous. Okay. Now, when I invited you onto the show, I sent you some questions. I hadn't read The Domestic Revolution yet, and now I have, and I want to kind of deviate from the script already.
Good, because I read your questions and completely forgot them.
Excellent. Good. So the Domestic Revolution is about how Britain shifted from burning mostly wood to burning mostly coal. And as far as I can tell from the book, they went from a system that was basically clean and safe-ish and, kind of relatively low maintenance to something that was expensive and difficult and dirty. Is that fair?
Yeah,
okay.
Basically it is.
So could you tell us what happened?
We just ran out of wood. They ran out of space. There are too many of us. It seems to have happened very quickly, and it happened because of the growth of London. London just exploded during the late Tudor period. I mean, if you look at Queen Elizabeth's reign, the capital more than doubles. It very nearly quadruples in size during one queen's reign. I mean, that if you get your head around that, it's enormous, isn't it? It's no wonder that it then struggled to provide everything it needed for its citizens. And weirdly, it did okay on food. Food supplies, not a problem. But fuel very quickly did become a problem. They just couldn't get enough wood in. So prices were rocketing, and people therefore had to find an alternative. So they were pushed into it by a population explosion in one place.
Ah, okay. And now, I've always sort of technically known that back in the Middle Ages, people washed their clothes with wood ash and even dung, right? Yeah. Which never made any sense to me until I read your book, which explains it perfectly. But it's not my job to explain these things. Because so could you please explain how you can use wood ash to clean your clothes?
Well, wood ash actually contains a really useful chemical. It was known in the past as potash. And it's a sort of an alkali, which you can leach out of the wood ash by pouring water through it. Any wood ash will do. You burn it, you've got the ash left. If you then use that wood ash, either straight or you leach the chemical out with water, you've got something which will cut grease and kill bacteria. It's free in every household that was burning wood. Everybody had access to it. And you've got both your sterilisation and your grease removal all in one chemical. It's really useful. So in a very simple way, if you're out in the woods and you have a fry up over a small fire, when you've finished eating your lovely bacon, you've got a greasy frying pan. The easiest way
Ruth,
to...
I think you disappeared for a second. Yeah, no, you're back again. Please, sorry.
So anyway, there you are, out in the woods with your greasy frying pan. You've eaten your bacon. Now, the way to clean that frying pan is to take a handful of ash from the edge of the fire, throw it into the pan, pop your pan on for a second so that it's just sort of warm through. Then a handful of grass, a splash of water, rub round, rinse. Done. The wood ash has combined with the fat in your pan to make its own soap. So you've cleaned your pan.
That is so much easier than using fairy liquid in a
Isn't
stream,
it?
as I have done. It doesn't work very well.
Exactly. The wood ash is actually better. It's also much safer for the environment and, biodegradable, blah, 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 blah.
Sure. Okay. And so dung?
Dung, well, weirdly, dung also contains, it's not as good as wood ash, but dung and urine also have chemicals within them that can be used for cleaning. Now, you don't use the dung straight. That would be a bit ridiculous.
Rubbing poo on your clothes, not a good plan.
No, not a good plan. But if you took some animal dung, and actually cow's particularly good if you can get it, and you pop it in a bucket with a load of water, leave it overnight, and then use the water the next day. And the water will have leached the appropriate chemicals into it. So you've got a sort of relatively clear looking liquid. And that's what you're going to rinse your clothes in. And again, it acts as a mild antibacterial agent, but also as a mild way of shifting grease, combines with grease. If you do it with urine, you really want to let it ferment. So you just pee in a pot and you leave it somewhere outside because it's so smelly and unpleasant. Outside with the lid on, you just leave it for 3 weeks. And in that 3 weeks, the urine ferments and changes and becomes ammonia. Well, we all use ammonia bleach around the house.
Right.
That's it's still a standard thing. These days they synthesize the ammonia, which to me seems the most dreadful waste. I mean, for goodness sake, we've got urine going to spare, How hard could it be to collect it and put it in a tank somewhere? I mean, how hard would that really be? But, ammonia, again, once it's a bleach. And like all bleaches, it smells of bleach. And it behaves like bleach. It does all the jobs that bleach will do. So for particularly your whites, it's a brilliant way of getting things really clean.
Okay, and you've actually done all this?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
It works.
Okay.
I mean, it really works. I mean, it works, to my mind, at least as well, in some ways better than modern products.
Okay, because there's a thing in your book, Domestic Revolution, where you mention near the beginning that you've changed the way you do your laundry at home based on what you do in practice. And then you talk about historical laundry, but you don't actually tell us at the end of the book when you're discussing historical laundry practices what you actually do at home.
Oh,
so
at home.
Can I ask you what you do at home?
I am very lazy. I love washing machines.
Yes.
I think the washing machine is one of the greatest inventions of all time. And I would rank it up there for the liberation of women with the contraceptive pill. So I do use a washing machine. I just don't put any product in it. I run it on water. That's it. Unless I've got something really, really greasy. If you've been making butter and your cloth is absolutely covered in it, or I don't know what else people do to get really greasy. Then I might use a little bit of soap or wood ash, depending on what I've got hanging around, to give it a quick soak. But so other than that, the washing machine does it all just with water. So
how would you use wood ash in a washing machine?
I would either pre-soak the clothes in a bucket, or you could just pour a little bit in with the like you do a detergent. But I wouldn't want to do that too often because I don't know. I don't have the skill about washing machines. I don't know how many exposed bits of gubbins they've got that the liquid might get in contact with, because it is a highly active chemical, and you would need to be really sure that your active chemical wasn't going to react with some component in your washing machine. So I would do it separately. So I'd do it, soak in the lye, and then just chuck it in for water washing in the machine.
Okay. Well, you heard it here first, chaps. You don't need all of these fancy detergents they tell you to put in.
You really don't. You really, really don't. It's quite shocking, I think. We've just been sort of groomed into it all of our lives. So were our parents, so were our grandparents. It's now traditional to rely on a bottle of stuff, and we believe in it like a sort of religious faith.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And, for a long time, we've been using just household vinegar as water softener in the washing machine, not using you get the conditioner because the soap ruins the clothes and makes them all stiff and horrible. You have conditioner to make them soft again.
Yeah,
right?
But you see, if you don't use any soap in the first place,
you don't need any conditioner.
You don't need any conditioner.
Well, that just makes sense. Excellent. And I understand that you've been involved in things like recreating the ovens that were in the Mary Rose, and sort of cooking on reconstructions of these ovens.
Yeah.
So These are wood-fired, correct?
Yeah, they're wood-fired.
Okay, so what is that like?
Oh, it's fantastic. I love it. I know I'm a bit mad. I've also been lucky enough to fire not just recreations but original ovens, and that's really special. The ovens at Haddon Hall up in Derbyshire had not been fired since at least 1700, when the house was shut up. And I managed to persuade the current owner to
let you have a go.
Yeah, to take the electric light out, which was in there to show people the inside of the oven. So we took that out, and that's it. Then I fired them. I've cooked in them dozens of times since. Dozens and dozens of times. They're really good ovens. They're beautiful. And they're very accurate. You know, there's a pair of them, and they were pastry ovens rather than for baking bread. They were for all the posh cakes and things. So controllable. And the food comes out.
So how do you control the temperature in a wood-fired oven?
You basically have to understand fire. And it's sort of something you can learn with experience. I mean, if somebody's with you, they can talk you through it a bit. But it is about a sort of sensual understanding of fire, of seeing the way it looks, of the way it sounds, the sorts of smells that come off it. It's quite subtle in some ways. So a really well-fired traditional oven, you should get sort of like a plume, you know, like the mushroom cloud with the nuclear holocaust mushroom cloud, yeah? That's the shape of fire you're trying to make, so that it comes up in a sort of stalk, hits the roof, mushrooms out, and coils round the brickwork. So the actual flame is licking around, almost right down to the bottom. And then the exhaust gases then get hauled back into the centre of the conflagration and reburned. So you get very, very little in the way of smoke, and very high efficiency in turning the wood into energy. And you can see that happening. And the shapes that the flames make at different temperatures also change. So if you're dealing with wood, I don't really know how to describe it in words. I call it dragon fire. It's like sort of when the flames take on a sort of arabesque shape, a bit like I imagine dragons would breathe. I know it's reached a particular temperature. Likewise, you can feel the sphere of heat coming out of the door. So if you put your hand near, there'll be a point at which you don't want to go any nearer. And it'll be quite distinct horizon, like this side of it, cool enough, I'm quite happy. A little bit, oh, ow. And you can sort of like move your hand around and you'll get a sort of a shape of where it becomes too hot. And that's another indicator, because as the space heats, it pushes heat out in different ways. So if you've got a sort of like a sort of a straight up and down chimney of heat, it's not ready yet. If you've got a shape of heat that is beginning to be more like a sort of a balloon shape coming out and encompasses and goes right down to the bottom of the opening, now you're at bread heat. So it's a really physical way of understanding the temperature. You're looking at it, you're listening to the crackle and the noise, because that also changes as the fire changes temperature. And often you find when you're using, it varies between ovens, but the actual stone and brick starts to smell different. So if you're using one oven often, you would also get that smell to back up your other sensory guides. So it's not something you can just switch on and like read a dial.
Sure.
It is something you have to sort of learn by doing.
Do you know, I've experienced this many times in woodworks. I used to be an antiques restorer, and problems which seem like really difficult and complicated to somebody used to like modern machine woodwork. When you watch somebody who was apprenticed 40 years ago and has just been doing this their whole lives, they will do it in a few seconds with a couple of super basic tools. And they have this sort of nuanced control over what they're doing, but just with really, to a modern eye, primitive equipment. It's like, you know, we're used to like turning dials on an oven and we can get it to 275 degrees precisely or whatever. But, you know, I imagine someone who's worked their whole lives with a wood-fired oven will, you know, if they need a particular heat, they may not have a number for it, but they know exactly how hot the oven is.
You
relative
really,
to the
really
pie.
do.
Yeah.
You absolutely do. And what you taught is you say it's hot enough for cake or hot enough for pastry or hot enough for bread. You know, that's how you describe it to other people. And you see those words in some of the period sources too. It's often, you know, that sort of very descriptive way of saying how you should cook something or what a fire should be doing. And yeah, you do develop this. And I think you have to be alive to it. I think a lot of modern people often take a very long time to make that because they're not sort of aware that that is learning, that experience. Right. They're not very good at taking notice of what their senses are telling them because they're not trained to take notice of what their senses are telling them. And I find if I'm teaching somebody, some people find that leap easy and some people find that leap almost impossible. It is a different way of approaching the world, a very physical way of approaching the world.
Yeah, and it's, if you don't mind my saying, it's a very martial artist way of approaching the world.
Is it really?
Absolutely. I mean, martial arts are all about that. Okay, the absolute best way to learn a technique like a joint lock, for example, is to have the teacher do it to you.
Right.
Right, and you feel it, and you learn to feel where the energy is going, where the forces are being applied, exactly how that's connecting your elbow is locked up to your shoulder, and that's turning your spine, which is locking up your hip, and your weight's in the wrong place because they've just nudged you gently onto that foot so you can't move it to get it out of the way. And there's all these little nuances, 1,000 little details that make the difference between a beginner trying to do the lock and someone who's really good at it, just putting it on with almost no force.
Yeah.
But when you learn to feel it, you get that sense of, okay, that feeling that I had in me, I now have to create in them. And yeah, it's the, once you've learned how to learn that way, it is by far the easiest way to learn martial arts.
It's something I've sort of suspected for a while because I did a lot of dance when I was young. And I find the martial arts stuff that I've encountered very interesting from a dance point of view.
Oh, sure.
And I know what you mean about physical learning in that, because dance you can only learn by doing. You know, I mean,
right.
You can learn by, but you have to learn how to learn by watching somebody else do as well as doing it yourself. And it's about learning to feel each little bit of you. A good dancer is somebody who knows exactly where each muscle is at any moment. And again, many people who don't have that sort of training really struggle with knowing where is my hand.
Sure.
Am I pressing it on this edge of the side or that edge of the side? That sort of understanding of your own body is very important in dance. And I've often wondered about that because, I mean, I know in a period that we're both interested, there seems to be quite a lot of crossover between dance and martial arts.
Oh, sure. It's movement. And,
yeah, exactly.
And the way I teach students to learn this, because again, most of my students, they come from a totally non-physical background. They're computer programmers or lorry drivers or whatever, and they're not dancers who come in. Or I mean, I do get some dancers, but generally speaking, they don't have any kind of physical background. Right. The mirror neurons in your brain are what make it enjoyable for people to watch things like sport, because it's how children learn to walk. It's by copying the grown-ups around them or the children around them who can do a thing, and their body gives them a sense, or your body gives you a sense of what it would feel like to do that thing, and your mirror neurons are what give you that. And if you can pay attention to that feeling and even give it a name, it makes it much, much easier just to copy what somebody else is doing.
Yeah.
Because the bit of your brain that handles language is not the bit of your brain that handles movement.
I think so, and I think exactly the same is true with craft things. So
absolutely.
Again, if you're trying to teach somebody to sew, or a friend of mine is a leather worker, and there are just some people who know how to watch, how to take notice, how to respond to what is coming in, and others who are just completely oblivious to anything that's going on, and it's exactly the same thing, making that leap between the two. Really difficult for some people.
Yeah, well, I used to be very, very verbal. I wanted verbal and intellectual instruction. I needed to understand it intellectually before I thought I could do it. And that's sort of how I was sort of programmed, I guess.
It is how we're all brought up. That's what the modern education system tells us.
Right. But eventually I kind of figured out that I didn't actually need all of that kind of intellectual crud blocking up my brain and stopping me from actually being able to do it. Like, again with woodwork, you have to know what a well-set plane is like. You pick one up that somebody who knows what they're doing has set. They've sharpened it and they set it and it's working just as it should. And you run it across a piece of wood and you go, oh my God, that's what it's supposed to feel like. And then you take your plane and you fiddle with it until it feels like that.
Yeah.
And, because the changes we're talking about are such tiny little nuances, you can't possibly... You can't write them down as a set of instructions. Agreed. Because, and every plane is different, so you make different adjustments to each, to get the same end result. Yeah. Oh, well, I was not expecting to geek out about woodworking planes today. Not right. Okay, now,
I think it's really another thing that's really come to me that's interesting. It's sort of related to this. Is my daughter obviously was being brought up as a reenactor all her life. Poor thing, she had no choice in the matter. But one of the things that she got really, really enthusiastic about when she was 8 years old was a technique of braid making. You know, loads of 8-year-old girls get into friendship braids or whatever. But for her, it was a 16th century technique. My husband and I started working at the Globe Theatre in London at that point. And, of course, you know, she just came with us. And the designer there got very excited when she saw the braid that my daughter was making. She said, "Oh my God!" And I said, "Oh yeah, it's a 16th century type of braid." And she commissioned my 8-year-old, she was just about to turn 9, daughter to make commercially, professionally for the Globe Theatre. So she did. Wow. At 9 years old.
Child labour. Well, that's historical.
I know, child labour. It was, but I mean, you can imagine how enthused that made a 9-year-old.
Sure.
Just like. This became a real thing for her, and she just kept doing it, and she is so expert. What I wanted to say was how different it was. It's changed her hands.
Sure.
What she can do with her hands is utterly different from I've ever seen any other adult, even somebody who's also keen on that craft, because she moulded her hands to fit the craft from a child when they were still malleable. So in a sense, that's just like dance training. You know, if you're somebody, I did ballet classes, that changes your body because you're using it in a different way. Your bones structure is actually different. You lay down different bone, you lay down different muscle. And she's the same with her hands and arms. She can do things that are just considered impossible these days. And yet it's clear that if you train from a child, it's possible. It's like violin playing, isn't it?
Yeah.
Learn young.
And they say these skeletons of the archers on the Merry Rose are identifiable because they have a twist in the spine from the archery. Which I'm not suggesting that's a healthy thing.
No,
you probably don't want that. But yeah, certainly, what we do leaves a mark on the body. Absolutely.
And I think it's all part of that a lost world really of physical training that you're talking about and I'm talking about. It does survive in certain areas of modern life, such as learning to play the violin, or there are areas in which we train like that and have attention drawn to the physical by outsiders helping us to nurture and build those sorts of skills. But it's unusual. It's not the mainstream way of learning anymore. Yeah,
it's all sitting in nice straight rows in school, which does not make sense to me at all.
Me neither.
Okay, now your book, How to Be a Tudor, is actually the first of your books I got into. And it's a really thorough investigation of what it is like to kind of wake up as a Tudor person and live the day and then go to bed that night. And it covers so many different aspects of life in the Tudor period. And you sort of skip over the swords a little bit. and I'm going to quote your own words to you, which is a terrible thing to do to a writer. I do apologise. But the use of weaponry does not appeal to me in the same way as, say, the making of cheese.
It's true.
and that's perfectly fair. And you sort of redress the balance a little bit in a chapter in How to Behave Badly in Elizabethan England, where you talk about some of the Elizabethan sword fighting stuff, which is good. It's nice that the sword makes a little bit of an inroad there. But I thought I should probably flag up to the listeners that you're a living historian and a recreator of historical skills.
Yes.
But not specifically a sword person.
Correct.
That's perfectly okay. We still like people who
are
don't like
much more swordy than me.
Sure. But you've recreated such an extraordinary range of different historical skills. So, do you have any suggestions for how we sword people could extract training practices from historical sources?
Oh my goodness, that's a difficult question, isn't it?
Well, I wouldn't waste your time with anything easy.
I think what I've really found is that breadth is really quite helpful. Mm-hmm. It's very, very easy to send yourself down a rabbit hole. We all do it. You sort of focus on a particular thing and not realise that something way over to the right or to the left or upside down or somewhere else, somewhere that seems unconnected, in fact, has a big influence.
Sure.
And I think many people, we all have our blind spots. We can't help it. But it's really quite useful sometimes to try and pull focus and to try and get a bit more context and wider, and to be open to the fact that other things might be feeding in that seem unrelated. And I find that all the time with what I'm doing, that by having a period of interest, a moment in time that I'm interested in, going sideways across it, rather than drilling down on one sort of subject vertically, I think I pick up more of that sort of cross current, and I think it's useful. I don't think very many people do it, but I think it's useful.
Well, in case you're wondering where I stand on that, I did invite you onto this show, even though you don't do swords at all. Yeah.
Good point.
So you're to me personally, you're preaching to the converted, but I know very, very many historical sword people who know all about the very specific, narrow, this exact style of this exact sword from this exact period. And that's all they're interested in. They're not interested in the clothing. They're not interested in the food. They're not interested in the dance. They're not interested in the social hierarchies that these people were doing their sword stuff in.
I don't see how you can be interested in sword and not be interested in the clothes people are wearing to do the swordsmanship in, because it completely changes the way you move.
Well, yeah, okay. It does change the way you move, absolutely. And I'm very much of the opinion that every historical swordsmanship interpretation needs to be tested in the clothing of the period.
Yeah,
right,
and
so
real clothing of the period, because there's so much, people pay lip service to this all the time and dress in theatrical mock-up.
Right,
and that teaches you nothing, absolutely nothing. I too can wander around in a spangly suit, great.
Yeah, I mean, just give you a specific example, right? Like Lycra sort of tights, sort of simulating medieval hose.
Yeah, pointless.
Basically, right. Well, I mean, they're fine if that's what you like to wear, but from a reconstructive standpoint, they don't behave the same, because they're not literally tied to your jacket with pieces of string.
Exactly. And the seams come in different places.
Exactly. Yeah.
You know, I mean, for sword, you need to know where the armpit seam comes if you're going to be using a sword. You need to know how that feels, how much it digs in, how much it doesn't, how much it restricts, how much you can move. Because a lot of those early tight cut doublets are really, really precise in where they allow you to put your shoulder joint.
Yeah, actually, you'll be pleased to hear that the very first guest on this show, Jessica Findlay, she does medieval longsword stuff.
Okay.
And she's also made quite a lot of historical clothing. And she went off on a little rant about medieval shoulder design and clothing. She absolutely did. So yeah, I mean, like the modern jacket does not work for medieval swordsmanship at all, because it doesn't allow you to move your shoulders in the way that a properly cut medieval gambeson would do, right?
Exactly.
Which will allow you to do, pull-ups and cartwheels and what have you, because it's designed to let you move.
It's one of the things we used to really work with the Globe Theatre on. Actors would start rehearsals and they'd have all these ideas about the sort of way they were going to move on stage, and would say, no, you've got you can't do any of that. That's all the wrong sorts of shapes. These are the sorts of shapes you need to be making with your body. Right. And it's not just in swordmen, obviously, but how you sit on a chair, how you walk across the stage, how you take your hat off, etc. And until you get the accurate clothing on and you start to practice in that accurate clothing so it becomes like a second skin and you're not always second guessing it, then you sort of see the changes. And it's really noticeable how somebody goes from looking awkward and strange and as if they're pretending into somebody who looks real. And
well, it's a language.
It is.
The way what you wear is a language, but also how you move is a language.
And it's very culturally learned, and I find that very exciting too. You mentioned too about learning to walk from watching people. That's exactly it. So each of us culturally moves according to the culture that we sit within, or the culture that we want to sit within. We often ape other people who are cooler or more fashionable or whatever, and therefore fashions in movement happen very quickly, and they sweep through the population very quickly, and they differentiate different social groups. And as soon as you're somebody who looks at movement, you see it everywhere, don't you? I play cafe game, I guess, where people have been brought up according to how they walk past on the street.
We should play that game sometime. I wonder how well I do. I've never actually played that consciously in terms of location,
because it really makes you look.
No, I look at when I look at somebody moving, I'm thinking, what stuff have they practiced?
Yes, which of course is part of it. Yeah.
Yeah. So like that person is definitely a wrestler. That person moves like a boxer. That person moves like a desk jockey who has never done any physical activity in their life. Yeah. You know, and
Sikh gentlemen have a marvellous walk. I really like to see a Sikh gentleman walk down the street. So distinctive.
Yeah, and it's funny. You know, there's a common sort of idea that there is one correct way, mechanically, biologically correct way to walk or to stand or to move, and it's just not true. Yeah, I mean there are certain types of movement that are definitely bad for you, but within the range of movement that is not bad for you, there's lots and lots of correct ways to walk across the room or pick up a box or whatever.
Yeah, I'm in full agreement with you there.
Okay. Well, agreement doesn't lead to good conversation, so let's
right.
let's see if we can find something to argue about. Yeah, okay.
Okay.
All right. Okay. So one of the things about historical swordsmanship, which is great, is we can test our interpretations. Yeah. So, you know, if I have this idea about how this particular technique works, we can set it up and see if it actually works against someone who's trying to stop you from doing it.
Yeah.
Right. And, you know, if you're doing medieval cookery, you get a similar kind of feedback. If it comes out of the oven like burnt to a crisp, clearly something went wrong.
Yeah.
So how do you handle the problem of incomplete information when it comes to things like recreating dance or whatever?
It's so difficult, isn't it?
Yes.
There are so many options. I think my real feeling is not to be quick to jump to conclusions. And I think that even when there's good evidence, it's very easy to think you know the answer and to just sort of skip over that bit. And you see people do it a lot, and I think it gives what we do a bad name in academic circles because it happens so often.
Sure.
People make dreadful assumptions, and you know they don't really test it out properly. They say they've tested it, but they've only tested it out in certain ways. The hard thing is getting your mind in the right place, I think. Trying to find out what it is you've taken for granted, because none of us know, because we take it for granted. Trying to unpick your modern attitudes and your modern opinions and somehow take them out of the equation. It's really hard, and you have to be super vigilant because they just creep in all the time. And you've got to sort of get really good at spotting, now is that just because I think it should work like that? You know, how rigorous have I been here? You just have to keep coming back at yourself and going, am I sure? Have I got this? You know, am I up my own arse, basically? It's such a tricky thing. All history involves it.
Sure.
Whenever you read a passage, you are busily interpreting it in the light of other things that you've read and other things that you've heard and the modern world that you live in, and trying to strip that out. Even just reading something really simple about traditional, I don't know, kings and queens is difficult. But when you're dealing with something as physical and personal as the way somebody moves or how something feels to eat, then it's even harder because we all have laid over the top this vast body of modern experience. How do you strip that away? I think you just have to be super vigilant.
Right, yes. And you know, finding feedback mechanisms where possible.
Where possible, and cross-corroboration. And you've got to be really quite wide-ranging in the sorts of corroboration you're willing to take, particularly where there's a lack of evidence. So, you know, I mean, there isn't, for example, a 16th century treatise on how to skin a rabbit.
No, you just put it off.
There just isn't. So how do you do it? Well, I mean, the obvious thing to do is to go and talk to lots of people who skin rabbits. But you can't just say, right, well, this must have been the way they did it. Because actually, when you start talking to a wide range of people who modernly skin rabbits, they don't all do it the same way.
Are you saying there's more than one way to skin a rabbit?
There's more than one way to skin a rabbit. It turns out there's loads of ways to skin a rabbit. And initially you think, they must have used all of these ways. But in modern world, you see that there are traditions in different areas of the world as to how to skin a rabbit. So how do you then say, well, which tradition did we use? Really difficult.
Right. Yeah, I've interviewed a swordsmith on this show called Craig Johnson, who's done a lot of work, you know, with historical weapons and recreating them using blacksmithing techniques and what have you. And I remember, I don't think it was part of the interview, but ages ago when we were in the States, and he showed me a nail head on a training rapier.
Yeah.
And he explained how he'd done it, and it took about 3 seconds, and the hammer marks were in just the same place as they were on the original. And it was like, he'd been working on how to do it for ages and ages and ages. And then suddenly his hands just did it for him.
Yeah.
And it was like, boom, there suddenly sitting there is this perfect reproduction.
Yeah.
And there's no way to prove that that's how they did it.
No.
But it was quick, it was efficient, and it leaves exactly the same hammer marks.
Yeah.
So...
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the first time I managed that was with a doublet, that in wear, the creasing and grease marks after a certain amount of wear were exactly the same as an original.
Right.
Like the way it had moved on the body. Like,
yeah, you're getting somewhere.
Close. Come close.
Okay. So, obviously, anything living history, swordsmanship included, involves lots of kit, lots of equipment. So I imagine that your house is completely filled with historical reenactment stuff. Am I correct?
Well, over the years, I've banished it.
Okay.
A bit more separation than there used to be. But that's mostly because of a bigger house these days, so it's a bit more possible.
Well, yeah. Okay, I remember I had this problem of I had too many swords, I couldn't hang them all up, and I had too many books. I didn't have enough book space. So do you know what I did? I got a bigger house.
Bigger house. Exactly. That's exactly it. With an enormous...
That's the solution.
Yeah, we got a double garage, which of course is full to the brim. And we got a van that sits on the drive completely full. It's a mobile shed. It's an occasionally mobile shed. And then friends and colleagues obviously have got more stashed in there.
Yeah.
Various cellars, garages, whatever. Yeah, kit everywhere.
Okay. Now, swords are like symbolic objects. Okay, so is there any particular item in your collection of living history gear that sort of symbolises the practice of living history for you?
Cauldrons. Everybody eats.
Cauldrons. Okay, tell me about cauldrons. I don't know anything about cauldrons except what I've read in your books.
Oh well, they're big and they're heavy, but they are the most basic piece of equipment. To be honest, people often talk about blades as being one of the base technologies of all human culture, and obviously they are. So is string, and I think that gets grossly underrepresented, and so is a pot. And obviously the earliest ones are, clay or upturned brain pans, probably some skulls, God knows what. But as soon as you've got a pot, you've got a whole range of new options available. I mean, it can carry liquid for drinking, it can carry... it's sort of like one of the most basic survival things. And when you look at the things that people owned in the past, a pot is the thing that makes the difference between having a home and not having a home. A pot is the thing you're willing to lug about when you can't bear anything else, because it makes survival so much easier. You can eat in a different way. You can eat different foods if you've got a pot. You have access to all the grains and things. You don't have to wait for somebody else to hand you a piece of bread. If you've got a pot, you can make a meal out of, almost anything. And that sort of flexibility. So I think pots in their general are deeply symbolic. They are half the home. And I think they are the central to a way of life, to a settled way of life.
Okay. Is there a particular cauldron in your collection that you're fond of?
Oh, I love them. I've got several reproductions, which are lovely, but I have also got a few originals. I don't, as a normal thing, I don't collect originals because I could. Because
you can't use them.
You can't. I would not be looking after them properly. They should be in museums. They should not be sitting in my house.
Right.
I don't really approve of private collections. But I have got a couple of little cauldrons, and they're so beautiful. I mean, they have such organic shapes as well, particularly the slightly sagged ones, the bronze sag bottoms. And though they've been used and used and used and used, that more hands have been on them than you could shake a stick at. Just beautiful.
Could you send me a picture of one of them for the show notes?
I could try.
So I'm sure people would like to see it. Okay.
Yeah.
No promises, but if you go to the show notes, you may well find a picture of one of these beautiful cauldrons that Ruth is talking about. I have never, ever heard anybody talk so passionately about a pot before. That's great.
That's because we take them for granted. They're so basic.
Right. Yeah. And with all these basics, it's when they're taken away, you understand exactly how important they were.
Yeah, just imagine life if you had no pots. Even in your modern life, imagine if you could never have anything that had been cooked in a pot.
That would just, wouldn't work.
I mean, grilled is all very well, but...
Wow. Okay. So I have a couple of questions that I tend to sort of wrap up with. And the first is, what is the best idea you've never acted on?
Rule the world, obviously.
Well, obviously.
Yeah.
Make us all wash our clothes in wood ash.
Yeah. Do away with public schools. Give everybody a shed. That would be, you see, if I was ruling the world, that would be my number one policy. After 7 years in any relationship, you would automatically get delivered a shed to you. See,
that's brilliant.
I think it would cut the divorce rate in half overnight. It would improve family relationships, and that, of course, would improve the mental health of the nation. It would improve the physical health of the nation. We'd spend less on the NHS. We'd all just be a happier, healthier people if we all had a shed.
Well, let me tell you something about sheds. When we moved to this house a couple of years ago, one of the selling points was at the foot of the garden, there's this beautiful, quite big shed that I have insulated and kitted out with heater and dehumidifier, and it's my woodworking shop. And through lockdown, I have spent, I don't know how many hundreds of hours in my shed. I go there pretty much every day, right? And it's awesome. And to the point, very soon, well, it's been delayed by Brexit and other things like coronavirus and what have you, but my wife is also getting an enormous shed. She's a Pilates teacher, and so we're moving all of her Pilates stuff out of the house and into this very large shed for her Pilates stuff. So I am 100% on board with your shed idea. So your best idea you've never acted on is give everybody a shed.
Yeah.
That's a really good idea. That is not at all what I was expecting.
No, yeah. I wish I could. I think Britain would be a much better place if we all had a shed.
Well, yeah, and Britain is like the promised land of sheds, isn't it?
It is really, yeah.
So, are you working on any new books? Is there another book coming?
Not really. I got a bit of a hiatus.
Okay, having a bit of a rest after the domestic revolution.
Yes. I see. The book I want, and also you have to be able to persuade a publisher, don't you? And that's not always
I'm my own
so
publisher.
Easy. Oh, well done for you.
It's I don't have to persuade anybody. I can write whatever I want, and as long as my students buy it, I'm all right.
You're all right. You see, it's not it won't be up your street at all, probably. I want to write a history of housework.
Why would that not be up my street? I mean, I've literally just spent like the last 45 minutes interviewing you about like washing clothes and stuff. So.
Yeah, well, that's true, actually. You have, haven't you? See, I think, again, it's really fascinating, and it's something that people don't normally talk about. So there's all this information out there that nobody's bothered to look at, nobody's really thought about. And, of course, what counts as housework has changed over
Absolutely.
and over and over and over again throughout the centuries. And the way we do it has changed over and over and over again throughout the centuries. It's really it's very political. Oh, God, is it political? I mean, any conversation you try and have about housework, particularly with your own partner.
I don't have conversations with my wife about housework. She says, Guy, do this. I say, yes, ma'am, and that's that.
Okay. So you're following the traditional pattern in which she takes all the responsibility and you are absolved of it.
No, I don't think that's strictly fair. No, it's just that when she goes away to, as before lockdown, like she'd go off to a Pilates seminar or something for the weekend, and she'd come back and the children would be like happy and fed and whatever, and the bins would be empty and the laundry basket would be empty and the fridge would be full. So
I'm impressed. I am impressed. Did your mum make you do that when you were a kid?
No, we lived in Africa and Peru and we had maids.
Oh, how interesting. That is really interesting, because when I talk to people, it's really, really noticeable how much continuity there is between what children are asked to do by their parents, particularly boys. If a boy is asked to do certain things by his mother, he will almost always do those things as an adult in his own home. If she doesn't ask him to do anything, he does pretty much the same when he gets married. It's a remarkably stable pattern, so you're unusual then. That's very interesting.
I haven't actually really thought about it in any sort of depth.
No, people don't generally.
I mean, it's fair to say that my wife sort of does most of the house stuff. That is just true. And that's largely been because I've mostly been doing most of the kind of going out and making a living stuff. But that's never been deliberate. It's just a kind of, how things have worked out with the way her work has gone and the way my job is going and that sort of stuff. So,
I think it's really interesting, and I think the sort of the way we think about it is obviously changing constantly. And attitudes change constantly, and they're not always quite as clear cut as people want. I saw people say, "Oh, yeah, but men never did any of that in the past." That turns out to be really not true.
Totally not true.
Really not true.
Yeah. Absolutely.
As soon as you start looking for the evidence, you've got a much more complicated, intricate pattern of changes as to who's responsible for this and who's responsible for that. And much more involvement across the sexes. The only real period of history in which you get men being able to choosing to largely opt out of that is a really short window in the early 20th century. And yet everybody claims that pattern is the pattern of history. It's not.
Right.
It's really not.
Well, it's the pattern of recent living so within living memory history.
Yeah, it is. That's it. And the people
that's how it must always have been.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That's exactly the thinking. People push that back onto an older past, and the reality is very varied and surprising in many ways. Yeah.
Yeah, and the idea that women didn't work.
Oh yeah.
Before it's like horseshit. It's like no, they just tended not to have the posh jobs that got recorded and talked about in books. But they were like spinning and weaving and making stuff and all sorts of things.
Bricks and
right, exactly.
Yeah. As soon as you like, I've just done a little research project for Ironbridge Museum and all about the women working in the industry in the 19th century, and that's been very interesting.
They're all in factories, exactly.
Yeah,
working in factories and doing all of that.
Huge amount of labouring. I mean, that's the thing that takes people. A huge amount of women who are digging, lifting, and shifting.
Yes.
Which we now think of as male occupations, but until about 1860, and there's a real turning point then. Until about 1860, you're in some ways more likely to find the lifting, shifting being done by women.
Really? That's fascinating. Yeah. Okay, you have to write that book for me, Ruth. Well, not for me, but
Yeah, the past is interesting, isn't it? It can't get under
very
the
much
skin.
So. Yeah, and do you know what? It reminds me a lot of what we've been talking about. It's sort of bringing up memories from when I was living in Peru, for instance, and up in the mountains, the peasant women kind of wandering around doing their thing, and they would almost always be spinning all the time as they were walking and talking. So something that would take me, 2 hours to kind of fiddle about with and get wrong, they are doing sort of unconsciously as they walk and chat to their friends and go shopping and do all the necessary things. It's just like they're also producing this yarn that they're then going to weave into cloth and make clothes out of and things like that. And living in Africa, we saw people cooking on wood fires using cauldrons. Yeah. And that wasn't some sort of, tourist thing. That's
that's what you do.
What they were actually doing. That's how they do it. So have you visited Africa?
I haven't. I'm very sad to say.
I think you might find, if you go to the right parts, you might see some really interesting things that remind you very much of your research.
I've always wanted to do some sort of anthropological sort of thing that studies that, exactly that. I've always wanted to do an anthropological project because I think the past is anthropology.
Sure.
And it would be really nice to have a bit more comparison with things that you can see in action nowadays in different places. One of my brothers spent 6 months in Africa, and like me, he has quite a practical background and was brought up with fires. Our parents were both scout leaders.
Right. That would help.
That would help. And ovens is also a thing that he's really keen on. So he spent 6 months in Africa building ovens out of whatever it was for various people.
Oh, wow. That's really cool.
Out in sort of some of it, yeah.
Cool. Okay, my last question.
Okay.
Somebody grants you a big chest of gold to spend on improving historical education and practice of living history. Okay, how would you spend it?
Oh, how would I spend it? I'll make more gun, build fires, basically.
Okay.
I think, the problem with that woodland school idea is it's awfully wrapped up in middle classness.
Yes.
And that makes it really off-putting, and I think for many people, and I think that's a real shame because scouting often sometimes suffers from the same problem, and I don't know how one would go around subverting that. But I really, really, really think every child should have time out in the woods, building fires, making a mess, digging holes, getting dirty, getting splinters, hitting things with a stick, having small burns, having a physical interaction with the world, that isn't pressured, isn't heavily supervised.
Yeah.
You know, it isn't got goals that have to be ticked off on a ruddy tick list. I was really lucky to get that as a kid. I did get it, and I made sure I passed it on to mine. But I know that sort of an education is really rare. But I think it gives you a grounding that the rest of life can then balance against.
Sure.
And I think it makes you understand people in other parts of the world better. And I think it makes you understand people in the past better. Because it's something that we share. That very physical, practical humanness is universal. It's the modern living that isn't.
Yeah, very true. Yeah, I used to live in Finland, and they are big on their forests and that sort of thing there. And, you know, one friend of mine who has kids, her eldest was very independent-minded, so they got her this little kind of panic button, basically, that they should strap on her wrist, so she could just go off into the forest for, like, a day with a bag with a sandwich in it. And so if she, like, I don't know, if she fell out a tree or something and she could hit the panic button and someone would come and find her.
Yeah.
Right?
That's a really good idea.
But it was, she was, at the age of 5, she was on her own in the forest, just, you know, having adventures with imaginary animals or whatever it was a 5-year-old does in the forest. And I've seen another friend of mine who, he does quite a lot of living history, and his son, when he was 3 years old, was chopping firewood, was sort of splitting kindling with an axe.
Yeah.
At the age of 3.
It doesn't surprise me, because it really doesn't. Children are much more capable physically than we ever give them credit for.
Right.
Likewise, my daughter, somebody gave, say we've been reenacting since birth, and when she was 18 months old, a friend gave her a small sharp knife.
Well, good.
But to wear on a scabbard, you see, like all grown-ups do. Everybody has a sharp knife, so she had.
That's right.
And I must admit, I probably would have waited another 6 months.
Yes, me too.
2, yeah, okay.
Yeah, me too.
It was actually really good because, you know, obviously we all were aware she had a sharp knife on her belt. Mm-hmm. And so we sat her down and we talked about it and we did it together. And, you know, it was a big deal. It's the sharp. Everybody talked about the knife. Everybody looked at her. She did it. And, of course, she had no strength because she was little. So, yes, she didn't have much control. So it did waver a bit about all over the place. But when it did, the cuts she made were tiny. Little tiny nicks. She never did any damage. And boy, did she learn fast how to respect a knife. By the time she was 3 or 4, I could put her to chopping carrots.
Yeah, my kids too. I started them out with, you know, I'm a blades person. So obviously in the whole point for me of like kitchens is the knives. And so I have nice kitchen knives and they are pretty sharp. And, you know, I've taught the kids, like when they were really little, they would put one arm around my waist and I would hold the carrot or whatever it is. And then they would hold the knife and I'd have my hand on top of their hand just to make sure nothing really bad happened. And they would chop this way. And the only person who could get cut was me.
Yes. And,
you know, they got the hang of it. And then after a while, they had their hand on the carrot and I had my hand on top. And then I took my hands away. And by the time they were like 3 or 4 or whatever, they
were perfectly safe chopping carrots.
And
I like we had no trouble with fires. Again, she grew up around fires. Never any bother.
Yeah, I think skill keeps you safe better than ignorance.
Yes, I do too. I really do. And understanding.
Okay, so you would have this, you would use this money to basically create like, I don't want to say forest school. Should we say forest experience? Forest
possibly.
Experience.
Forest time.
Forest adventures.
Yeah, adventures and time. Without too many bloody interfering adults. Because that's really changed in my lifetime. And you know, you and I probably of a similar generation. The amount of supervision children are under nowadays just shocks me.
Yeah, it's terrible. I try not to impose that on my kids.
It is. I mean, you know, as a sword person, many of your listeners, I imagine, are reenactory types. And I think it's one of the great things that reenactment as a hobby offers. It allows you to do a little bit more free-range child rearing and a little more sort of village-raised children. You know, because you're with a group of people that you sort of know that the child is dressed strangely so they can't wander off too far because somebody will notice. You can afford to be there's more eyes keeping a lookout. You can afford to be more relaxed with the way you care and give them that space and give them that freedom and allow them to pick and choose who they want to talk to.
Right. And what they want to do.
Yeah. And I really valued it as a parent. I just thought this is a really nice way to bring up your kids. And the fact that it's not all the time, that you can intersperse it, like you can have the sort of more conventional modern life during the week, you go away at the weekend, you have this, I suppose, quite hippie life in a way. But it means they've got both sides of the coin, doesn't it? It means a kid's got all these options to choose from later in life, more experiences to draw on. Yeah,
and they can make informed decisions rather than just going with what the narrow range of what they otherwise grew up with.
Yeah, exactly.
Excellent.
This isn't about swords at all, is it? It's been about general philosophy of life.
But exactly. But let's be practical for a second. I mean, who needs to know how to use a sword properly?
Oh, everybody, surely.
In the 21st century.
True.
Pretty much, people like me who teach it for a living, we need to know how to do it. Yeah. But other than that, really, no one else needs it. You don't do it because you do it because it brings you alive. It wakes you up. It's for us sword people, there is no way to explain it because it's obvious. Yeah. And we talk about swords the way you talk about fire.
Swords are beautiful. I'm willing to accept that.
Well, I think that is a perfect place to finish on. Great. Well, thank you very much for joining me today, Ruth. It's been a delight.
You're welcome. I hope some of it's useful.
Thanks for listening. You can find the episode show notes at swordschool.com/podcast, where you will find transcriptions, photos, videos, and links for this episode. You can find a direct link to the show notes for this episode in the description. Join us next week for another cracking conversation. See you then.